Hi everyone. So, today we are going to continue the discussion on representations in Unit 4 and this is lecture number 29. Today we are going to discuss a very important work titled The Role of Stereotypes by Richard Dyer, which was published in a book called Media Studies, a Reader, edited by Paul Morris and Sue Thornham. Now, I am going to illustrate how this question of representations has been understood by Dyer and why it is important for media understandings, and this will be a continuation of what we did through Stuart Hall's works. So, Richard Dyer argues that representation is important as what and who we see within culture and media. It shapes, limits and expands who we imagine we or others could be. So, the first significant point is this question of imagination. So, the representations in media, it expands our imaginations. Bell Hooks and Stuart Hall works further argue that representation in popular culture commonly operates through the othering or stereotyping of difference, which is basically reduced to spectacle or fantasy. This means that when we think about media, most representations are of the mainstream with the marginalized identity generally stereotyped, and this stereotyping is done through difference, which reduces it to ideas of spectacle and fantasy. With roots in cultural studies, representation theory plays a very critical role in exposing how power structures are sustained and subverted within media representations. So, what we are trying to focus on is this idea of representation, othering, stereotypes, etc. More recent theorizations have sought to address the importance of embodied effective dimensions of representations. So, we are looking at the effective and the embodied dimensions, which mean the more phenomenological kind of dimensions, and decolonizing queer, feminist and critical race theory perspectives have highlighted the political limits of greater visibility, inclusion and recognition. This is also something that we will talk about. Critical race theorist Herman Gray, in his article Subjected to Recognition, he offers a compelling critique of greater visibility. What is this critique of greater visibility? Gray argues that we are experiencing the limits of the political potential of representation in the context of new media technologies, because many of these represented ideologies and ideas are actually appropriated. He questions whether more inclusion of racial subjects in media in the Western context can actually achieve greater social, political and economic power. While image centric technologies have brought increased visibility, because you have different kind of representations, difference has become a product which is commodified and marketed, and therefore, this does not have the same role that it would otherwise have politically in creating a consciousness. So, what this means is that representation and the debate on representation for the longest time has been about diversity and inclusion, that you include diverse representations. So, if one thinks about Harry Potter and its cinematic representation, it would be argued that there were different kinds of representations, but even then those representations had limitations. So, the first step, as has been discussed, is representation, that you have diversity of voices, identities, socialities represented. But the next step is to go beyond mere representation and bring about nuances in representations. Otherwise, giving only representation is what Gray suggests, leading to basically a commodification. So, the representations of Indians, for instance, in the cinematic representation of Harry Potter, they were again stereotyped in ways that Indians would dress. So, what you have is representation which is now there, but it is not nuanced enough, and instead it is also commodified and marketed, because everything in neoliberalism becomes commodified and marketized. Now, the difference is displayed only as a part of an individual's identity, self-expression or lifestyle. So, in the process, the collective struggles over visibility which marginalized groups have historically engaged in, that gets erased. So, the point is not to have an African American actor or an African American representation alone. The point is also to think about why that representation has historically not existed. Now, Herman Gray asks whether this has become a new form of subjugation for such groups who become commodified and also reduced to basically normative subjects of difference. So, what you have is then basically a reduction to a difference which is celebrated. It is exoticized, but it never becomes the ordinary, nor is it understood in terms of the historical erasure and marginalization. For instance, a lot of digital vlogs today would concentrate on Northeast India, how beautiful the region is, how people there are nice, etc., without focusing on the historical kind of negligence that the region may have faced or erasure or from representations of mainland India. So, what is happening is that there is representation, there is curation, but it is also commodifying. It is not really bringing in any kind of substantial equity. Now, the word stereotype today has almost become a term of abuse, where it stems from this wholly justified objections of various groups to how they find themselves stereotyped in the mass media and also everyday speeches and representations. So, when we think about stereotypes today, there is an understanding that it is not a nice thing. Now, a pattern of stereotypes, Dyer would argue, is actually not neutral. It is very interesting that when stereotypes operate, it is not done with the intention of neutrality. It is not a way of substituting order for basically reality. It is basically with a structure, and as we have seen through the works of Chomsky and Hall so far, that media operates through structures. Now, the stereotypes are highly charged with the feelings that are attached to them, and they also become the fortress of tradition and also how people feel about these stereotypes, and then obviously their representations. Stereotypes as a form of ordering which the mass of complex and inchoate data that we receive from the world are a particular form, and to do with the representation and categorization of persons of the wider process by which any human society and individuals within it make sense of that society through what would be patternings and typifications. So, when stereotypes are used as a form of ordering, they are rooted in generalizations, patternings and typifications. What is also to be kept in mind that unless one believes that there is some definitively true order in the world which is basically revealed to human beings and unproblematically expressed in their culture, this is a belief that the variety of orders proposed by different societies, as sociologists, anthropologists, historians analyze this activity of ordering, it includes the use of stereotypes. It has to be acknowledged as a necessary, indeed inescapable part of the way that societies make sense of themselves and also how they reproduce themselves. In fact, the idea that Dyer is trying to promote here is that stereotypes as a form of ordering don't always exist only for outsiders, but also insiders. For instance, when one thinks of themselves as an Indian, as we are, we would stereotype ourselves, and it is not only others who would stereotype us, but it is also we ourselves who would stereotype us, and that also contributes to how these stereotypes are then carried forward. The fact that all such orderings are partial and limited does not mean that they are untrue. So, many of these stereotypes will not be fitting on each and every person. Stereotypes are partial, but they are also true. Finally, the need to order basically the great blooming, buzzing, confusion, reality, it is liable to be accompanied by also a belief in the absoluteness and entirety of any particular order, a refusal to recognize the limitations and the partiality which basically also correspond to the incapacity to deal with the fact of reality. So, essentially what Dyer is trying to say is stereotypes sometimes make one's job simpler, because when you imagine particular society through the partial knowledge that you may have, it is comfortable. So, if you know of let us say a particular country and you know only one thing, it helps you to think about that particular country in that way. It contributes to your reality, which is not confusing. Now, we had looked at the works of John Berger, who looks at ways of seeing as an analytical framework to understand how the gaze itself in forms of media is curated. Now, sociologists Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman look at the social construction of reality in their work, which stresses basically not only on any given society's ordering of reality as a historical product, but also implicated in the power relations. So, what we have is how stereotypes and representations emerge as part of the power relations of every society. And that is the reason why Bell Hooks and Stuart Hall would argue that representations of differences, representations of marginalized identities in media as well as elsewhere are governed by power dynamics, where these differences are always reduced to either spectacle or fantasy. For instance, this example that I gave of Northeast Indians being reduced to exotic, nice people, beautiful people, etc. Again, it minimizes the collective struggle that they have undergone. Now, Walter Lippmann's notion of stereotypes as a shortcut also points to the manner in which stereotypes are very simple, because when you use a stereotype, you are actually using a shortcut to understand a particular community. So, if you look at the Indians as representations of a particular religious cultural identity, it makes your job easier through the shortcut, because you do not have to think about the diversity of the country. So, in many movies, Indians have been primarily represented as turban wearing, which is a symbol of the Sikh community. So, most Indians have been represented through the Sikh identity. The reason is that it becomes a shortcut also because you have many migrants from India who are Sikhs and who have lived abroad. So, the idea is that when you think of an Indian, you think of that identity, right? And also films that are based on migration, diaspora, non-resident Indians, they have that Sikh identity, again to talk about basically the idea of the Indian as a stereotyped Indian through this shortcut. It basically also immediately refers to someone's immediate identity, and in that sense you do not have to have knowledge of the complex social structure. So, what you can do is basically use the stereotype as a shortcut, where you find that the way that ideas are represented, it simply becomes a shortcut. So, Arnold Linsky's analysis of the representation of the alcoholic in popular magazines between 1900 and 1966, where changing depictions of alcoholics are shown to express complex and contradictory social theories, not merely of alcoholism, but of free will and determinism. It was not in that sense a stereotype study, because you had several ideas of who an alcoholic is. The stereotypical shortcut idea would be that an alcoholic is a person who drinks a lot, may be abusive to their families, etc., and the story ends there. There is no nuance when a stereotype is used. The focus of representation in media is basically also aesthetic and social constructs. We have been talking about the social construction as well as the focus on aesthetics, and we will talk more about it later in this unit as well. and the stereotypes are a particular subcategory of a broader category of fictional characters, which would be basically the type. Like I said, that it becomes a shortcut. Stereotypes are essentially defined, as in Walter Lippmann, by their social function, what social function it does or has, and types are primarily defined by their aesthetic function, namely as a mode of characterization in fiction. So, the types are also a little different from the stereotypes in the sense that they become these characters and you can categorize them, whereas the stereotype is basically about the social function. And the stereotype therefore becomes a great tool to represent, because you have different kinds of representations and then you can also stereotype them. So, if you have, let us say, a film made with one character from every country, the person chosen to represent the Indian context would be a very mainstream looking Indian and not someone who would have different features or speak a different language other than Hindi. Reason being that the stereotype represents basically the kind of representation which is very shortcut and stereotypical. So, what we also have is that the stereotype in representation theory in these popular forms of media etc., becoming a tool to basically bring in a shortcut way of representing ideas. The opposite of this is the novelistic character, which is defined by a multiplicity of traits and gradually revealed through the course of the narrative, a narrative which is hinged on the growth or evolution of a character. And therefore, when you have a novel, the character is not a stereotype in most cases, it is evolving, because you have that kind of also writing, it is a long form writing. And in most societies, this is the novelistic character which is privileged over the type, because the obvious reason is that when you have a novelistic character, it has many layers and shades. In stereotypes, the layers and shades are missing. So, how the camera gazes at you is also rooted in the way that the media operates. So, if you are represented for a few minutes, mostly it is your stereotypical characteristics that are represented. So, in many cases it may not even be the fault of how the film is made or the content is produced, but depends on the nature and as well as the intent. Once we address ourselves to the representation and definition of social categories, for instance the alcoholics, we have to consider what is at stake in one mode of characterization rather than another. This is the sociological interest point, that why are the different types and social categories necessary. Where do we want the emphasis of the representation to lie? On the psychological, on the social, or in some articulation of the two. So, how do we represent these ideas? The choice or advocacy of basically a more novelistic or a more typical representation, it again connects to these emphases. So, how does one want to portray the story? So, if you are making a film and you are showing how certain men grow up to be sexually assaulting or rapist, but your focus is on basically the victims' wrongdoings, how they may have invited the harm onto themselves. There are ways in which the camera is projected to capture the images, where you are creating a narrative of empathy and sympathy for the people who are the criminals. So, what you do with the camera, how you present the characters, the evolution, how you represent them, whether you show layers, whether you stereotype, all of that goes into the making of the media content. Now, this is also a function of the stereotype which is important, which is that it maintains boundaries between basically where the pale ends and who is clearly within the boundary and who is beyond it. What this means is that stereotypes do not only concern themselves with social types, but they map out the boundaries of acceptable and legitimate behavior. They also insist on boundaries exactly at those points where there are none. And one can see this when you look at stereotypes dealing with social categories that are invisible and or fluid. These categories itself are invisible because you cannot tell just by looking at a person whether or not they belong to the category in question. So, in many ways stereotypes, they function as, making you understand how boundaries operate, but in most of these cases it could also be that the boundaries are not visible to you. Now, unless the person chooses to dress or act in a very clearly and culturally defined manner, for instance, the working man's cloth cap, the male homosexual's limp wrist, or unless one has a trained eye, it is impossible to place the person before one, whereas many social groups like women and men, different races, young and old, they are visibly different, and this difference can be eradicated only by disguise. Now, this difference between these groups, that also needs to be captured, and they need to be captured, but the stereotypes can be avoided in the representations. Social categories can be fluid in the sense that it is not possible in reality to draw a line between them and adjacent categories. Social categories are always adjacent because if I am a woman, I could also be, a black woman, and these categories are fluid, they are not really very, very rigid. So, when one is portraying, let us say, a sensitive portrayal of womanhood, it is also important to have the sense to sensitively portray my blackhood and my being hypothetically the subject here. So, what we also require is a focus on the intersectional interconnections between these identities. So, when there is a representation of a homosexual person, instead of stereotyping them into the ways that we already believe homosexuals operate, there is a possibility that you treat it with sensitivity and respect. Now, what we also see is the role of stereotypes in making visible the invisible, so that there is no danger of it basically creeping up on us unaware, and to also make very firm and separate what in reality is fluid and much closer to the norm than the dominant value system cares to admit. What you have is basically very visible ideas of how social types operate, and these stereotypes become ordering concepts. So, again, when you have a film rooted in ideas of good and bad, certain people will represent good, certain will represent bad. In a mythological content, you have a very clear distinction between the good and the bad. So, some will represent who the good are and some will represent who the bad are, and these distinctions are again very, very clear in terms of also the stereotypes that are rooted. So, the asuras in Indian mythology have been portrayed as drinking alcohol, maybe molesting women, and again characteristics which stereotype their behavioral and social expression as well as representations. All societies need to have relatively stable boundaries and categories, but this stability can be achieved within a context which recognizes the relativity and uncertainty of concepts. And such a stability is achieved only in a situation of real as opposed to imposed consensus. The degree of rigidity and shrillness of a stereotype, it indicates the degree to which it is an enforced representation which points to a reality whose invisibility and or fluidity, it threatens the received definitions of society promoted by those with the biggest stakes. For instance, if women are not so very different from man, why are they subordinated is a question. Similarly, if alcoholism is not so easily distinguished from social drinking, can we be so comfortable in our acceptance of the latter and condemnation of the former? The idea is basically to think about how differences are portrayed. So, women and men could be different and they are biologically different. However, how that difference is portrayed is where the distinction between stereotype and real representation begins and ends. So, if you are focused on a film that talks about, let us say, women players or athletes, the comparisons should not be drawn in such ways where constantly the gaze is on how the women are not performing as well as the men, because it will end up reproducing the same stereotype that women don't know to perform as well as men, and therefore you need to basically present it in a way where the women, when they are performing as athletes and achieving their accolades, can be accepted for the fact that it is the women in their own sphere competing. So, these representations have multiple roles to play, and therefore, in media theorization there have been quite a lot of interest in how representations take place in the media. Now, both Hall and Dyer in many ways represent a theoretical kind of intervention to understand how these representations operate, but we also want to talk about how these representations are visible in the way that everyday realities are basically observed in the social world. What you have is that a discussion on stereotypes in this lecture, where we are trying to understand stereotypes and the social role of stereotypes, the function that it plays, and also the cons of stereotypes, what it ends up doing. It ends up creating very homogeneous kind of representations, and that is why we also require diverse kind of representations. So, while the stereotype gives a representation, it has this function of basically limiting the gaze to how the mainstream media and the understanding wants to locate and look at minorities and marginalized social identities. Thank you.